Hello, welcome to Aging Well in America. I'm Anne Marie Gattari, your host. Every day, 10,000 people turn 65 years old in the United States. 5.5 million people today are aged 85 or older. By the year 2050, which isn't that long from now, 20 million people will be aged 85 or older. Are we ready? Is America ready? There's so much good work going on around the country, around the state, and right here in our own community. And we have with us today another one of those community residents who's doing a lot of good work to help us as we age. Welcome, Don Wheaton, attorney who makes house calls and litigator extraordinaire. It's nice to have you on our show. I think this is a first, is it not?
It is. Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Great. Thank you, Don. A lot of attorneys do estate planning. You do as well. But it's important to find somebody, just like I suppose a therapist or a doctor, who really fits well with you, because you're talking about some pretty personal and emotional issues when you go in to have your do estate planning, which again is something that you need as you age and face the really the end of your life. Tell us a little bit about how you work and the type of client who might do well with you.
Well, as you noted, I am the lawyer who makes house calls, and whenever I get a call from a client or a potential client who wants to do some estate planning, the first thing I ask is, do you mind if I come visit you at home? I often find that clients are much more at ease, and if any documents need to be retrieved or produced, where are they? They're not going to be in my office. They're not going to be usually somewhere else. They're usually in the client's home. So that's the first thing I ask.
So they can get up and run into their home office or wherever they keep their papers, and a lot of running around probably in those meetings.
But the nice thing about estate planning with the client and working with the client is that we want to make them comfortable with one of the most difficult things that they have to face, and that's, I'm not going to be here someday. Some people are better at being very clinical and saying, I understand this, you know, I've started dying the moment I was born, but...
And I've got to prepare for that, right?
Yeah, you have to prepare for that event, and you want to make sure that you state what you want done with your assets and all the things that you want to happen after you're gone, because if you don't, the state will be more than happy to come in and tell your descendants, your heirs, what's going to be done. And a lot of times people don't want that to happen. Maybe they want to purposefully skip somebody or another. For example, if you were married and your spouse passed, and then you don't have any children, maybe your rotten brother would get a share of your estate. You don't want that to happen. So you want to make an estate plan. And at bare minimum, you have to have a will, and you want to have a power of attorney for your finances. Whether you want to give that power of attorney while you still can make your own decisions, or you want it to be a springing one that pops up and is usable only when you can't. You want to make sure you do that too. And the one that is absolutely critical is a medical power of attorney or a living will. That's what it's often called, where you designate someone to be your patient advocate. You want to have a few backups in case that person's not available or just can't handle it under the circumstances.
Now, if you have backups, does that create the potential for there to be a conflict between the various people you've given that power to, or can you clearly state?
You can clearly delineate whether you want two people to do it, whether you want one person, and then if they don't want to do it or they can't do it for whatever reason, they're not available, then the next person in line is there. That's why you want to have some backups.
I understand.
So that way you're always covered and people will know your wishes. But even more important than creating these documents is being able to find them.
Yes.
Because, and this just happened in my own family. You would think it wouldn't. My father-in-law and my mother-in-law are going through this right now. And he had a hard time finding some of the paperwork because she took care of it.
And you couldn't just go to their attorney who had drawn the papers up?
He didn't remember who it was because it was so many years ago.
There we go.
So it's been a struggle for them to find things. So, and I always tell my clients, make sure that you make several copies of these. Make sure that the people who are going to act for you obviously have a copy or access to the original. And you also want to take a package of them, because we've learned with superstorms like Katrina and Sandy and all that stuff that whole regions can be wiped out. If you have relatives or friends that you trust somewhere else in the country, send them a package, seal it up. They don't have to look at it, and tell them to keep it safe.
No,
just in case something
that's
happens
interesting.
in our area where the whole area gets wiped out. In Hurricane Katrina, for example, so many records were lost. And how do you get them back? Well, if there's a set of them somewhere else in the country.
And preserving them electronically doesn't always do the trick?
No, it doesn't. It's okay if you can retrieve them and recreate them, and you've given specifically in there that a reproduction of the document is as good as the original. Unfortunately, sometimes banks, hospitals don't like the reproductions. They want an original. So even in an event that obviously you could send an original out of state and that kind of thing, because you can do multiples and sign multiples. Comes like a real estate closing almost.
Sure.
When you're signing all these documents, but it works.
Yeah. Well, when you're talking about your life's work, right, your assets that you've earned, why shouldn't it be like a real estate closing?
Good point.
Yeah.
Good point. It's also important that you provide numbers where you can be contacted, and just make sure that those people know where the documents are, so they have them.
Good. Very good point. Something we don't often think about. We think we leave the lawyer's office and we're good to go.
Right.
But not necessarily true.
Very much so. Very
Yeah.
much so.
You talk about some other issues that we don't often think about when we think about our elderly parents. And sometimes it's not necessarily for that age cohort. It may even be for those of us who are in the baby boom generation. But we may have children coming back to live with us after being gone for a number of years. That can create some legal issues. There's some other things we want to talk about too, like ending a long-term marriage or even filing for bankruptcy at later in life. And you've got ideas on all those. Let's start with the one that gets all of our our anxiety up a bit when we talk about adult children coming home.
It is a huge issue these days. We see a lot of kids who are in their 30s and 40s that may be going through a divorce, maybe going through a bankruptcy, whatever it might be, whatever the circumstances are. Sometimes they bring their whole family with them because they're so financially strapped that all of a sudden grandma and grandpa are now being care providers and opening their homes back up. And that causes a lot of strain on the parents in this one.
Sure.
Not just the younger parents of the grandkids maybe, but the parents who've opened their house, and here come those kids again.
The homeowners. What are some of the legal issues that may surround that?
Well, some of the legal issues that come in are, basically, here you have a grown man, woman, kids, some grandkids coming in, who is on the emergency cards for the kids at school, and who can pick them up and take them home, that kind of thing. Those are really silly. It may sound like silly, but it becomes important. But there's not a lot of legal issues per se about the kids moving home. It's more about what the legal issues are that the kids are facing. And then do the parents feel obligated to help them pay their bills so they can get them the heck out of the house again, kind of thing. You get used to having an empty nest.
Yes.
And when those kids come back, it's, wait a minute, who are you? I can't do what I used to do, and I feel like I'm not even in my own home anymore.
Right. So are there, have you seen contracts drawn up among different, two generations of family members? Like,
I have.
You can come back for this period of time, but,
I've seen parents do leases with their kids. You're leasing part of my property because they want to help, but at the same time, you don't want the kids basically saying, hey, we got it pretty good here. We don't have to pay for a roof over our heads. We don't have to pay for electricity. Maybe they're not paying much for food, whatever it might be. There's only so much largesse that a parent can handle.
Is that something you would recommend, Don?
I would, actually.
Yeah.
And that way it puts some parameters on that relationship. Rather than just come home, move everybody here, it would be very helpful for them to have something in place that says, these are the restrictions, this is the deal.
What do you say to families who you can see this is really a need? They need to have these boundaries, but yet they're thinking, oh, I can't do that to my own flesh and blood, have a contract. This is the home they grew up in, and they should always be welcome.
I understand what you're saying.
From my point of view, I can see it having a negative impact on their health, right?
Yes.
On the elderly parent's health. And I have seen that, in fact, in my business in Bright Star, where this is who's caring for whom becomes quite an issue. And so perhaps setting some boundaries around it, even if it does seem something cold or clinical, does merit and should be done.
Yeah, it falls in line with the good fences make good neighbors kind of maxim. It is an uncomfortable topic to bring up if you're the one who's either side of that issue.
Sure.
But it definitely is a help, I believe, when you have that kind of boundary set and established, so that way the kids don't take advantage of the parents, and the parents don't feel taken advantage of either.
Right.
Everybody's playing by the same rule book.
Right.
Especially when you have, if it's not just one, if it's a couple with their children moving in, maybe they parent differently than you parented those kids. And then lines get blurry about, well, can Grandma pick up the kids from school today? That'd be great so that we can do X, Y. That gets a little rough if you don't have some boundaries established. It doesn't have to be in a document, but you at least have that discussion, and so everybody knows who's doing what and why. And it's an uncomfortable situation, but it's happening much more and more frequently.
Is that something you can help with, even if it's not a legal document? Just help sort of mediate those conversations?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a reason we're called attorney and counselor at law.
Yeah.
And we do spend a fair amount of our practice counseling people on better decision making, what to do, what not to do. And in a lot of events like this, I will have the grown parents calling me saying, holy crap, these guys are moving in, they've lost their home, whatever. What can I do? What can we do? What can you do to help us? And I always ask, have the kids checked into any number of avenues, any sort of debt reduction plans? Have they considered filing for bankruptcy if they're already losing the home, that kind of thing, to help them get a fresh start? It's been, I'm no real estate expert as far as mortgages and things like that, and the rules and regulations on that change with frequency. That's why you seek out a specialist in that area when you're looking for a loan. But it is my understanding, and been on the street for a couple years, that if you file for bankruptcy, you lose your home, you're going to have to wait at least 3 years before you can even apply for a mortgage.
To get a new one.
So the parents need to know that if the kids have lost the house, how soon are we going to be able to realistically get them out of here?
Right. Now, what about the opposite end of that, the opposite of that, which is something I think we hear more of, or at least we're more vocal about it, and that's us moving our aging elderly parents in with us, or us moving in with them to care for them.
Right.
Because they really cannot take care of themselves the way they did 5-10 years ago, and they need help with cooking and cleaning. They may need even more help than that with personal care, and depending on their cognitive and their physical medical situation, it could be something that is an issue. Are there legal ramifications of that?
Sure, there can be.
Yeah.
Some of the let's say there are multiple siblings, and the parent moves in with one of those siblings. For whatever reason it is, doesn't matter. They picked one. Maybe they're the closest to them physically, or geographically, I mean. Or maybe they're the closest to them emotionally. Whatever the reason is, they pick one of the kids. And then they come and they want to talk about redoing their will or redoing their estate plan. And questions of undue influence almost always pop up, meaning that that particular person with whom they're living has unduly influenced them to get a better benefit at the end of life. That's always out there. And it needs to be a very transparent process between the parent and all the siblings that are involved. Now, let's just say, let's set that issue aside, but that is a concern that people have to address and be very clear about in their estate planning. Other issues that come in, then who's responsible for mom's debts? Who's going to take care of mom's checking account? Is mom still doing it herself? Are we doing it? There's all basic day-to-day things. Maybe they don't create legal issues necessarily. You know all these. You're in Bright Star Home Health Care, and you see this on a daily basis. Like, you know, the kids are doing their very best. When do they get a break? Do the other siblings kick in to hire somebody like Bright Star? And can you put that in an agreement? Sure you can. That can be put in writing because, okay, mom and dad have moved in, or mom or dad has moved in. They're getting X number of dollars from Social Security or a pension or both. And then, well, how do we then pay for all the things that need to be paid for?
Well, often there could be the sale of a house involved as well.
Yes, there is.
Right.
There's often, and then becomes a question of how is that money managed? Are mom and dad capable of managing that?
Sure, right. So there's the living arrangements. What about divorce among the aging? Someone's been married 50 years plus, 40 years, 60?
I have not seen anybody in the 50 area.
No?
The longest marriage that I've seen in my practice was 42 years.
Okay.
It was one of these marriages where the wife and the husband stayed together for the kids, and for, you know, because that's what you do. They hated each other. They were both miserable, absolutely miserable. But untangling 42 years of legal arrangements that they've already made can be very difficult. So it becomes very important that, first of all, that you respect the length of the marriage and the people involved, and you try to keep them from going to trial. And you probably think that's kind of counterintuitive, but as a lawyer, very few cases go to trial for a lot of reasons. One, there's a ton of cases out there. Two, judges hate to try cases. They really do. They don't want them there, and they will do everything that they can to keep them from going to trial. And the third thing is after that kind of time together, you know they probably have kids, they probably have grandkids, they may even have great-grandkids at that point.
Yes.
So you want to try to keep as much of the familial ties as strong as possible, even though mom and dad are getting separated and eventually divorcing. So we want to be very, very considerate of the estate plans of both, how we untangle those and make sure that each side has something in place. We want to make sure that that they don't get broken financially by getting divorced. We do everything that we can to keep them from hating on each other so much that they're just trying to do it to hurt each other, as opposed to let's just break this up.
We hear a lot of people say they've stayed together because a divorce is expensive, and I'm assuming that means because you're now dividing assets. And
it's also because it's an economy of scale being in a marriage.
Right.
You know, when you have two households that pay rent or mortgage and utilities and food and all that other stuff, it's far more expensive than living in one. Now, I have seen, after many years, these same reasons. Now that the real estate market has picked up, the divorces are ticking up a little bit.
Is that right?
Because now you can sell the house,
You have
whereas before you couldn't.
It's not as expensive to do that. That's amazing. I hadn't thought of the economic impact of that.
If you have a couple that is underwater on their house, meaning that they owe more than it's worth, a lot of times they will stick together for no other reason than they have no asset, really, and nobody wants to assume the liability of the house themselves. And if they try to sell it, then the parties have to kick the money in, and it doesn't work.
What advice do you have for people who may be in this situation? They're looking at 30, 40 years, and they're thinking, I thought, you know, maybe things would change, and this is, you know, the person I want to spend the rest of my life with, and I had hoped. But it's clear now that that's not the case.
Well, if any client comes in and wants to talk to me about divorce, the first thing I ask is, have you been to counseling? Have you both been to counseling? Have you tried to work all these issues out? And frequently I will get answers that, yes, we've been to counseling, it didn't work, or he wouldn't go, she wouldn't go, I went, and it's just never going to work. I always want to make sure, because the last thing I want to do is, especially a long-term marriage, you want to break it up. And then you have to ask questions of, if I'm representing typically the wife, I will ask these questions. I don't represent typical wife. I do both, you know, husband and wife. But if it's the wife coming in on a long-term marriage, I ask, did you work outside the home? For how long? When did you start? You know, kids. Did you raise the kids? You know, traditional, like my parents. Mom stayed home till I was in high school, and then she went back out in the workforce. You know, Dad was the breadwinner, kind of thing. And I see a lot of that still from that generation when you have a longer-term marriage. And if it is the case where Mom stayed home and raised the kids and she took herself voluntarily out of the workforce, well, now we're talking about spousal support on a lot of it. Even if it's you know, even if nobody's making a lot of money, there's still spousal support considerations.
Even if they're both currently retired and they're living on,
that's a little tougher.
You know, pensions and Social Security. You take into account those years when one or the other was a stay-at-home?
It does factor into the equation.
It
There's
does.
no question. And pensions, especially when the mom is staying at home and the dad is out working and building up this pension, the pension, whatever the marital portion was, meaning from the time that you started, you know, the date of the marriage to the date of the divorce, that's the marital portion of the pension. If the husband is still working, or even if he's retired. Retired is a little tougher to split up, but it can be done.
Interesting. So many considerations.
Very much so.
Yeah, the best thing to do, I think, as you said, is to seek help from the experts, whether it's a counselor, even
your pastor.
Your pastor.
Or priest.
That's right. An attorney, of course.
Sometimes going to visit an attorney, believe it or not, puts the light of day on the financial situation, and sometimes they say, maybe we ought to try to work this out.
Well, and often, too, and I'm assuming this is true for you, and I'm sorry if it's not, but the first visit, the first meeting is a consultation, and there's no charge. Is that correct?
Absolutely. In my practice, the first hour that we meet is no obligation, and it's no charge.
Right.
It's complimentary consultation.
So sometimes I know of situations where lawyers have actually talked people out of going down the path that they thought that they had, you know.
I have done that, yes.
Yeah. And it probably feels pretty good, right? Because you've
does.
helped people to think of something in a different way and maybe.
It does. It's a little counterintuitive, and people think, what are you, stupid?
Yeah.
Because you just lost, you know, potentially a large chunk of money for yourself. That's not what I'm there for.
That's right. If it needs to happen, it'll happen and they'll be back, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Let's talk about bankruptcy among the aging. Are you seeing an increase in bankruptcies? And
we saw it more a few years ago as the real estate market plummeted. Not seeing as much, but it is still out there. I mean, bankruptcies in general are going down. Which is a great thing.
That's good to know.
You know, the economy is improving, and you know, a lot of times you can take some steps that will help the client avoid filing for bankruptcy. It's a very drastic step. It stays on your credit report for 10 years.
Bankruptcy.
Bankruptcy does.
And bankruptcy, give us a quick definition of it. It's not. Is it as simple as walking away from your home, or is there more involved in that?
I don't think there's ever anything as simple as walking away from your home, but
well, not that that is simple to do, but we hear, you know, it's happened, right?
No question, it happens.
It's happening now, even in our community.
Yes, but in a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, which is a liquidation, you take all the debts that you have, you list them on a petition and schedules, and then you take all the assets that you have and you list them on that same set of schedules. And the lawyer's job is to try to maximize the amount of assets that are exempt from execution or marshaling by the trustee, meaning the trustee will try to grab them, sell them for the benefit of the creditors. Okay.
Okay.
But when you
what would
have
be an example of that? An automobile?
An automobile, you only get $3,750 roughly. So you might have a $30,000 value car that you may own. You only get to exempt $3,750 out of that, so you need to find the other, what is it, $26,250 somewhere. And a lot of times that means the debtor is going to pay some money into his estate. So, or it's very convoluted, but it's also incumbent on the attorney to sort through all of those issues.
Is it as simple as your debt is greater than your assets when you put the two columns side by side?
Actually, no. Sometimes people have more assets than debts, but when that happens frequently, the asset side that's higher is in retirement vehicles like IRAs, 401ks, and generally those are exempt from execution or marshaling by the trustee.
Okay.
However, in certain circumstances, the trustee can go after that. So it's very important too, when you're considering filing for bankruptcy, that you sit down with an experienced bankruptcy attorney who can engage in what we call pre-bankruptcy planning. It's not illegal to take a chunk of money that may just be in cash and put it into a retirement vehicle so that you can avoid having it taken by the trustee. Now, on the other hand, the trustee may come in and say, hey, wait a minute here. Let's take a harder look at this.
Right.
But it really just depends.
And as you said, once you do that, you've got 10 years of this on your record. So what happens in that 10 years? What can you not do?
Well, you can't get as cheap of credit as you'd gotten before. But you will get credit. You'll get tons of credit offers. No matter what the banks say.
But the rate.
Yes, exactly. No matter what the banks say about people filing for bankruptcy, they're more than happy to extend credit again, but at a higher rate, with more fees, lower limits, that kind of thing.
Okay. And purchasing a house, you forget about getting a mortgage in
usually
this
2 to
period of
3 years. Like
is that right?
earlier when I said if you lose the house, you're definitely waiting 3 years. If you didn't lose a house during the course of a bankruptcy, you might be able to qualify in a couple of years.
Okay.
Yeah, the rules change with the financial institutions. I don't know how they calculate a FICO score or all those kinds of things. I don't even think that anybody but the highest ups in those companies know how those scores are prepared. But the point of fact is you will eventually be able to get a loan. You will eventually be able to refinance, that kind of thing. But it's going to take some time. You have to be patient.
Does age factor into it?
It really doesn't.
It doesn't.
And as the credit restrictions have gotten tighter, as opposed to the Wild West days of a few years ago, it is a little bit more difficult for everyone to qualify for credit now.
Yes, we see that, even though interest rates are so much lower, at least on homes.
Yes, phenomenally lower.
You're not going to believe it, but we've come to the end of our 30 minutes.
I would believe it, yes.
Thank you so much for being a guest. Don Wheaton, the lawyer who makes house calls. You go to people's homes where their files are, where it's convenient for them, and talk about a myriad of issues and events in their lives that they could use help with. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Aging Well in America. Please do send your ideas and your suggestions for future episodes here at the Grosse Pointe War Memorial.